Hello and welcome back to World 360. What are the major takeaways from the NATO summit this week? What major agreements did Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina sign during her recent visit to China? And lastly, how are Yemen's Houthi rebels digging for strategic depth, having now opened a new office in Iraq? We answer this and more in today's episode. First up, the NATO summit. NATO, as you know, is a major military alliance between America and Europe that was formed after World War II, and it turned 75 years old this year. This week, US President Joe Biden hosted various heads of state, including Ukraine's president, in Washington, D.C. for the NATO summit, which basically sought to shore up support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Here are some quick takeaways. NATO leaders agreed to begin transferring F-16 fighter aircraft to Ukraine. These are among the most sophisticated American-made fighter jets, known for their maneuverability and combat radius. Speaking at the NATO summit, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the F-16s were being transferred from Denmark and the Netherlands to Ukraine. Those jets will be flying in the skies of Ukraine this summer to make sure that Ukraine can continue to effectively defend itself against Russian aggression, Blinken said. Ukraine's president said such military equipment was necessary and cited the attack on a children's hospital in Kiev recently as the kind of atrocities that the Russian state allegedly commits. There were also some new faces at the NATO summit, namely Sweden. This was its first attendance of the summit after years of maintaining military neutrality. Finland, another new entrant to NATO, was attending for the second time, having already debuted at last year's gathering in Lithuania. Let's look at what the NATO joint statement said about China and Russia, whose growing alliance ever since the Ukraine war broke out has heightened apprehensions in both the US and Europe. Paragraph 26 of the statement clearly says that China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its support for Russia's defense industrial base. The statement doubles down on the West's efforts for Ukraine to join NATO. In no uncertain terms, it states, Ukraine's future is in NATO. Ukraine joining NATO is something that Russia has repeatedly opposed and even claimed such efforts for NATO expansion is the reason it chose to invade Ukraine. Now, another point from the NATO summit is Spain Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's words, where he accused the West of double standards when it came to the Ukraine war and the Gaza war. He urged NATO leaders to set aside double standards on Israel's war in Gaza and push for an immediate ceasefire. This NATO summit was important for Europe, which continues to grapple with the economic and political ramifications of a now 2-year war in Ukraine. There are also fears of what a potential change in the White House could mean for Europe. US presidential elections will take place in November this year, where US President Joe Biden will be seeking re-election against his Republican rival, Donald Trump. And if we look at Trump's views on NATO, they aren't so rosy. He has been known to bash the military alliance on many occasions, accusing allies of not paying up and meeting defense spending requirements. In fact, in February this year, he sent shockwaves through Europe when he implied that Russia is free to attack any NATO ally that wasn't meeting defense spending obligations. Trump's bonhomie with Russian President Vladimir Putin has only heightened fears about what his potential return to the White House could mean for the future of Europe. For our second topic, we look at Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's recent visit to China. Keep in mind this took place when PM Modi was on a bilateral visit to Russia. During the Bangladesh Prime Minister's visit to China, 21 agreements were signed by both sides following delegation-level meetings between the two nations at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Agreements were made on trade and investment, digital economy, infrastructure development, disaster management support, and building of the 6th and 9th friendship bridges between Bangladesh and China. There was also export of agricultural products that were covered in these agreements, as well as people-to-people connectivity and cooperation in the economic and banking sectors. Now, Chinese Premier Li Qiang and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina held bilateral talks which mainly featured the Rohingya issue, business, trade and commerce, investments, bilateral relations, of course, as well as regional and international matters. One of the announcements also included fast-tracking the China-Bangladesh Free Trade Agreement, or the FTA. As per Chinese media reports, talks on deepening cooperation on the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, was also discussed. Xi Jinping said that China hopes to deepen high-quality Belt and Road cooperation with Bangladesh, and Hasina responded by saying that Bangladesh will continue to actively participate in such cooperation. As you know, the BRI is China's multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that seeks to connect Asia with Africa and Europe via land and sea networks. For our last topic, we're looking at a deadly militant group in Yemen that seems to be seeking greater strategic relevance. I'm talking about Yemen's Houthi rebels, who are backed by Iran and have been launching attacks on ships in the Red Sea in support of Hamas in Gaza. Now, the Houthis are an insurgent group that controls most of northern part of war-torn Yemen, and they largely follow the Zaidi sect of Shia Islam. Yemen has been in the grips of a brutal civil war since the Houthis seized the capital in 2014, and the internationally recognized government retreated to Aden in the south. This civil war has served as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two big regional powers in the Middle East. And while the rebels are reportedly backed by Iran, Saudi Arabia has been at the forefront of a coalition fighting the Houthis on behalf of the government. Now, the Houthis' involvement in the Red Sea amid the Israel-Hamas war seems to have given the group a new impetus. They recently opened a new office in Iran's Baghdad. For years, Houthi leaders, including their representative in Iraq, Abu Idris al-Sharifi, have found refuge in Baghdad since 2016. But opening up an established office is new. Experts have viewed this as part of the Houthis' attempts to cement their growing regional clout, having carried out a violent campaign in the Red Sea against Israel and its allies. At the time, experts pointed out that this campaign in the Red Sea eroded US influence in the Middle East, allowing the Houthis to gain some political clout, per se. A report by Sputnik claims that the Houthis' new office in Baghdad is located very close to the US embassy in Iraq's capital. However, Iraqi officials claim this is not a formal office for the Houthis, nor is it their headquarters. The Middle East Media Research Institute, or the MEMRI, is an American non-profit group and is a good one to follow on the latest movements of the Houthis in Iraq, and in fact, they also reported on this new office. As the Gaza war continues to rage, it appears Israel and America's enemies are growing more emboldened, and the Houthis' efforts to deepen their strategic relevance is a case in point. As a report in London-based news outlet Amwaj Media points out, the Houthis' core aim is to knit itself as an indispensable thread in the webbing of Iran's axis of resistance. And this axis of resistance, as you know, is essentially seeking to counter Israeli and American influence in the Middle East. Not just a new office, reports indicate that the Houthi group has launched several social media platforms, primarily the Ansar Allah platform on Telegram, and therefore this appears to be part of its campaign to expand its reach and establish itself even further. The Houthis have also been putting out some interesting messaging in which they seem to be trying to punch above their weight. They recently issued a stern warning to Saudi Arabia against escalating conflicts and threatened retaliatory strikes. This was also around the time that drone footage targeting Saudi airports and ports were released. The opening of Houthis' Baghdad office marks a pivotal moment amid geopolitical shifts in the Middle East. Iraq, of course, finds itself navigating a delicate balance between national interests and regional dynamics, and its support for such groups may backfire. But one thing's for sure, the ongoing war in Gaza has seemed to embolden militant groups in the Middle East who aren't afraid to showcase their capabilities and signal their strategic intent. Thanks for watching. This is Pia Krishnankutty for ThePrint.